Well, my father had died. He died in the summer of 2009, right after Father's Day. So the first Father's Day rolled around. I don't remember how that first Father's Day affected me. But the second Father's Day, for some reason, I was thinking about my dad more frequently, about the things in my dad that I loved, that I respected, ways that I I know he went through the way he went through life, and it was just a way to capture some of his my memories of him, to capture who he was as a person, to do so in a humorous fashion. My dad had a dry sense of humor, and and I literally was standing out on the patio, right out here, looking at a pile of wood, and it reminded me of a couple of those stories, like the day I watched him move a pile of rock,
Yeah. Yeah.
toting two 5-gallon jugs of rocks, and how he loved to sweat and loved to work and loved to worry. So,
Great. Thank
yeah.
you.
Mhm. Father's Day 2011. From my patio, I stared at a wood pile in the back corner of my yard. It was Father's Day 2011. The sun decided to show itself that day. As I broke a sweat, my mind drifted back a few years to a cold, drizzly Seattle afternoon near the summer solstice. I phoned to check on my dad and Mama in Texas. Skipping the preliminaries, Mama said, "Honey, I'm so hot. It's 103 degrees with 99% humidity." Now you might wonder if my mama was exaggerating or at a minimum making her best guess. This was not the case. My mama is a woman with an outstanding trivial memory. She doesn't know about European history or American literature, but she knew Zazu Pitts was born on January the 3rd, 1894, and that Lana Turner was from Wallace, Idaho. She read movie magazines. When it comes to the family memory, she is the record keeper. All in her head. She knows the anniversary of me losing my first tooth. April the 21st never passed without an acknowledgement at our house. Approaching 85 years of age, her memory was still precise. Though admittedly she was helped by this fact. The only TV channel my dad would allow was the Weather Channel, and during the football season, the Dallas Cowboy games. After my dad retired, he was home 24/7. He began watching my mama's soap operas. As king of their house on Whitehurst Road, the soaps were soon banned. He thought there was way too much sex going on. Ever the eternal optimist, my mama found the Country Music Channel and Ralph Emery interviewing country singers, who were soap operas of their own. My dad tolerated this until Amy Grant divorced what's-his-name to hook up with Vince Gill. I don't know why my dad would shoot himself in the foot like this. In banning these entertaining shows, he ended his favorite hobby, complaining about what he was intently interested in. My mama's activities were pared to 3: cooking 2 meals a day, feeding chocolates to her 3 little mutts, and watching the Weather Channel. When she said it's 103 degrees, she knew what she was talking about. After the East Texas weather report concluded, I asked to speak to Dad. My mom said, "Honey, he'll have to call you back. He's re-roofing the house." Now, some of you might be surprised that my 85-year-old dad was on top of his house with a hammer and roofing nails, but I was not. He had the money to hire this out to a younger professional, or he could have attacked this project when the weather was more tolerable in Texas. But my dad lived to sweat. As I waited for my dad to call back, I remembered, with some internal chuckling, another of his summer sweating episodes. It was 105 degrees the day I arrived for my annual trek to Texas. My toleration for the hellish East Texas weather had been softened by the more amiable summers of the Pacific Northwest. One morning, with a fresh cup of instant Folgers coffee in hand — my parents were unaware of the sophisticated coffee scene in Seattle — I wandered outside. Dad was working in the backyard, though it was 100 degrees by mid-morning. The sight was worth an inquiry. "Dad, what are you doing?" "Moving rocks. They need to be on the other side of the yard." He stooped over and loaded 2 5-gallon buckets, half full of a huge pile of rocks. And with the tenacious strength of a pack mule, he lugged those buckets about 50 yards to the opposite corner of the property. "Can I help?" "Oh, no, I got it." With a glance to my left, I eyed the wheelbarrow leaning against his shed. With a tinge of sarcasm, I followed up. "Can I get the wheelbarrow?" "Oh, no, it's easier this way." There was no logical explanation for his actions or his methodology. But my dad never let logic stand in the way of a good project. He was simply living his highest axiom in life: do it the hard way. Now, I've never been one that enjoyed watching work, especially when it's being done the hard way. I sauntered back to the deck to finish my cup of Folgers and read the morning newspaper. A couple of hours later, my dad, having completed the rock relocation, slowly walked up, clean and soaked. My dad never got dirty when he worked. As a child, I remembered he would come home from work, remove his tie, roll up his sleeves, the sleeves of his starched white dress shirt, and go to his garden. He would weed, pick some strawberries or corn, thump on some watermelons, and generally work the soil. After an hour or so, he would come inside, clean and soaked. Not a bit of dirt on him except his hands. I could walk to the garden, not touch a thing, and look like I had bathed in a pile of dirt with the enthusiasm of a dog rolling on a dead carcass. As my dad stood on the deck, clean and soaked, I asked, knowing the answer that would come, "Can I get you some tea?" "Oh, no, I'm going to make me a cup of hot coffee." The greatest lesson I ever learned in my life from my dad was this one. That's not my judgment only. Son, if you never listen to another word I say, listen to this. Nothing will quench body thirst like a cup of hot coffee. He swore there was scientific proof for his belief. I don't know. I personally prefer iced tea or a cold non-domestic beer when I'm thirsty. Though my dad remained clean at work, he sweated like a politician strapped to a lie detector. This was not because of physical labor. My dad was lost if there was not emotional sweat as well. He lived to fume and fret. He was manager of Manley's Tire and Furniture Store. He sweated at work because of Mr. Manley himself. B.S. Manley was a son of a bitch, or so my dad said. I never knew what B.S. stood for, though I once heard my dad use 2 words that were consistent with the letters B.S., but I have some doubt that any mother would be inclined to name her child that. Mr. Manley stood 4 foot 8 inches tall, with a belt size of equal length. He had a fat, balding head and a bulldog face. For the few of you who remember, he looked like Broderick Crawford's uglier brother. Manley was an appropriate name for his wife, Opal. Mrs. Manley was what some call a handsome woman. She stood at least a foot taller than Mr. Manley. She was a big woman, not fat, more like the build of a middle linebacker. I think my mama believed Mrs. Manley and my dad were having an affair. As a boy, I wasn't sure what an affair was, but I absorbed enough information to conclude that if you were going to have an affair, you might as well have one with a woman who looked like Joey Heatherton. I was particularly fond of her since I'd seen her dance on the Dean Martin show. My dad always came home from work clean and soaked, thanks to the Manleys. Later, he operated his own TV and appliance store where he worked up more sweat than the Manleys could have ever squeezed out of him. I think it was the reason he went in business for himself. My dad was not content to leave his fret sweat at work. He fretted avocationally as well. Fret fume oozed from him on the Sundays the Dallas Cowboys played. A Tony Dorsett fumble or a Troy Aikman interception or a Leon Lett screw-up turned our den into a steam room. And I've seen my dad run from the living room with drooling palms to fetch his leather Bible after he read another asinine comment by the likes of Pat Robertson or Jerry Falwell. Though my dad was a conservative Southern Baptist, he had no toleration for conservative Baptist TV talk show hosts. But nothing juiced up his emotional sweat more than the Republicans. Now, my dad looked like a Republican. He talked like a Republican. He had the personal conservatism of a Republican, but he was a Democrat. Now, you should know we lived in the most conservative county in East Texas. In fact, all of Texas. In the election of 1964, Gregg County voted in favor of Barry Goldwater over native Texan Lyndon Johnson by a 3-1 margin. My dad believed he and my mama were the only white people in Gregg County to vote for President Johnson. This was after all the citizens were warned on television that if Goldwater were elected president, the little girl picking daisies and all the little boys and girls in America would be blown to bits in nuclear annihilation. In spite of the dire consequences, being a principled Christian people, Gregg County chose the sacrifice of their children and grandchildren and maybe the whole human race rather than to vote for that rat bastard Johnson who had pushed through the ungodly and repugnant legislation, the Civil Rights Act of 1964. My dad spent the last decade of his life in sweat heaven. The reason? The election of George W. Bush as President of the United States. I say president, though my dad refused to refer to him by that title, since he believed the election was an illegal heist of the White House. Nonetheless, Bush gave my dad a daily dose of fret sweat more vitalizing than his prunes and vitamins. It was if my dad was back to work full time with a purpose to fret and fume the American citizenry back to their senses. Don't think the election of President Barack Obama, for whom my dad gladly voted for at age 90, eased the fret sweat flow. The Bush fiasco, as my dad referred to it, gave him enough fodder for reflective fuming for the rest of his life. Nothing juiced my dad's emotional fret and sweat more than the Republicans. Well, except for sex. Now, overall, political sweat wins because of my dad's constant, almost daily fuming on the subject. But my dad didn't talk about sex. He didn't want to hear it referenced to on television. He didn't want it discussed. As far as I know, he never thought about it. But when it reared its ugly head, sweat would rain off of him like an East Texas gully washer. I remember one Friday night, a few years ago, sitting in my parents' living room with Frida, my 3 adult children, and my in-laws Fred and Della. We had pigged out on all kinds of cake and ice cream and were now engaged in a family free-for-all. The conversation was crisscrossed and sideways. It was loud. My mama's little mutt, Missy, was yapping with her unbearably shrill bark. Out of nowhere, into this noisy din of confusion, my mama spoke. "I just want to know what oral sex is." She had obviously been sneaking a peek at the Oprah show. Silence, even from the mutt. Then, with the precision of 2 synchronized swimmers, my daughters turned their head toward my dad, dropped their jaws, and said, "Granddaddy," as if he had committed an unpardonable sin. The next thing you know, Carrie and Stacy are on my mama, one on her left and one on her right, speaking in soft voice, but with exuberance, about her question, as mama got an earful of oral sex. This all happened within seconds. In the meantime, my dad, who had been sitting comfortably in his air-conditioned living room, now looks like he had taken a shower. Vapor fumes were rising from the top of his head. He jerked himself out of his chair, fretting and fuming and cursing under his breath, and walked outside into the East Texas humidity to cool off a bit. It seemed my dad could have spent less time working up a sweat moving rocks and more time pursuing a more pleasurable sweat. A couple of years ago, I got a phone call from my sister, Janice. "Darrell, the doctor's putting Daddy on hostel." "Do you mean hospice?" "Oh, yes, hospice. My sister moved in with my folks so my dad could spend the last 6 months of his life in a hospital bed not in a hospital bed in his own home. In early July, a week or so after my parents' 71st wedding anniversary on a Sunday afternoon, my sister whispered, "Daddy, Daryl's leaving on Tuesday to come see you again." She told me later a sweat popped out on him and he fumed, "Oh no, I don't want him to see me like this." He died the next day. He fretted and sweated himself to death. He left as he had lived. So I had stared at the woodpile long enough. As I carried an armful of logs across my yard, fumbling a few along the way, I heard from the patio, "Honey, can I help?" "No, I got it." "Can I get the wheelbarrow?" "No, it's easier this way, but as long as you're asking, I could sure use a cup of hot coffee."